So this week we are going to finish up our 19th century unit and kind of close it out with two writers that lie in the realism, naturalism, and regionalism literary movements. The last few authors that we have read were in the romantic literary genre or the dark romantics if you look at someone like Hawthorne or Poe. But realism is a stark departure from the romantic period because people, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why we have this shift from the romantics to the realist, and a lot of that comes with the uh, industrialization and the move from kind of the agrarian farm life to city life, the rise of a new middle class, so to speak, and the wealth that is brought in with cities, and then the new occupations and things like that, which we'll talk about when we talk about the yellow wallpaper. But um, the industrialization and certainly also the American Civil War brings this into light because it impacted people's views. It led to a certain uncertainty about the future. And to be quite honest, the invention of the camera and seeing things in real life also has to do with it. But part of the underlying reason that we have this shift from romanticism to realism and naturalism and regionalism is because, and I'm sure that you guys will commiserate, the public had little patience for the slow-paced narratives and allegory and symbolism of the romantic writers. America was shifting, and readers wanted writers who clearly communicated the complexities of their human experiences. They had enough of this, symbolic, metaphoric type of thing. Like if you look at someone like Poe or Hawthorne, and they wanted to move beyond that. So we have this realism, naturalism, regionalism, this reaction against romanticism, and it's better to just these movements are better described as writing techniques rather than philosophies. Naturalism develops from regionalism, I mean from realism, and regional writers could fall in both the realist or naturalist category. So we're going to talk about this more in just a second. So realism is exactly how it sounds. It's the faithful representation of reality. They believed that the individual was simply a person, not some sort of hero or idol or god in their own built narratives, or somebody to embody the ideals of. Naturalists, they turn to scientific principles, like with in Charles Darwin had a lot to do with the evolution of this movement, but scientific principles to study humans without moralizing and having these overarching moralization kind of thematic moments, in the belief that the individual is a helpless object. So they're also looking at the psychology of the individual as well. And regionalists, they're also called local color, which we'll talk about. They capture a location or the traditions of a location. And if you think about it, in the mid 19th century, post Civil War, there's a lot of expansion westward, and there are new territories and new regions all across the country, and writers sought to encapsulate those the kind of local color of of a very much growing country. So realism, by definition, is recreating life in literature. It's the experience of the commonplace or verisimilitude, the recreation of truth as life as it really is, not as we imagine it to be or how we'd like it to be. Character becomes more important than plot, in that we want to focus on the individual and the psychology of the individual, the presentation of the individual, how they talk, how the characters talk with one another. Realism interprets the actualities of any aspect of life without idealism, and it stresses the real over the fantastic. So it's a probable, these are real, the events and things that happen in these stories are probable and could happen in real life. And this kind of belief that humans may or may not be in control of their own destinies. Some characteristics of not naturalism, realism, some characteristics of realism. Like I just said, character is more important than the action or plot, because they have to make complex ethical choices. Characters portray real complexity. They have temperament, motive, they have a social class tied to them, they have a past that's tied to them. Class becomes important as well, which we'll talk about. Events are plausible, and the use of diction is natural. It's written as people talk, not in this poetic kind of language, so it's easier to understand. Naturalism is an offshoot. It's kind of a darker picture of realism, where characters do not have free will. They have they become combatant with their environment, and an environment could be not only nature but social forces, external, internal forces, environment or heredity control their behavior. And this idea of determinism, where free will does not exist because that will is often enslaved on account of different reasons. So we are victims of our own personal situations. Okay. Naturalism, by definition, is an extension of or a continuation. It's an extension or continuation of realism. Instead of being, I don't want to say that realism is always optimistic, but naturalism is particularly pessimistic. It deals with raw and unpleasant experiences and reduces characters to degrading behavior in their struggle to survive. And it's usually set in the commonplace and unheroic kind of setting, and its life is usually found in the dull round of daily existence. So there's that focus on that. Characters with in the naturalist movement, there's a sense of objectivity and detachment. Human beings are people to be studied impartially without moralizing about their about their natures or their choices. So there's not that passing of judgment like we would have seen in someone like Poe or Melville or Hawthorne. Characters come from lower middle class or the lower classes, and this one of the stories that we read comes from the poor, kind of uneducated, unsophisticated, and the other is more middle class setting. So, and then there's that discussion of fate. Generally, the controlling force is society and the surrounding environment. So that impacts our characters greatly. In literature, naturalism and realism introduce new topics to broaden the scope of American fiction. There's an exposure of social conditions and social evils, and it focuses on the lives of the lower classes. Characters then are conditioned and controlled by the environment, heredity, chance, or instinct, and there's that struggle for life and the ability to maintain human dignity, which becomes heroic. Regionalism can be either naturalistic or realistic, but it lies in that camp. But it's also called local color. The focus becomes on characters, their dialect, their customs, the landscape, and other features particular to a specific region. And typically, regionalism is a short story technique, and it's typically associated with women writers. People like Kate Chopin could be considered local color because she writes about the Louisiana area. Sarah Orne Jewett, or Sarah Jewett Orne, I can't remember or Mary Wilkins Freeman. They write about the New England area. If you've ever read The New England Nun, it's a great short story. But regionalism has a focus on setting. It emphasizes this emphasis on nature and the limits it sets. The setting is typically remote, and it's integral to the story. Many settings may sometimes become a character in itself, and I urge you guys to pay attention to that when we read A Jury of Her Peers. Some other characteristics of regionalism: we are concerned with the character of the region rather than the individual. Characters become character types and are sometimes stereotypical. And those characters are marked by the adherence to the old ways, dialect, and personality traits central to their region. So, our authors this week could be considered, they're certainly both realists. One is more regionalism, or regionalist, or local color, with A Jury of Her Peers. And then we have Charlotte Perkins Gilman in The Yellow Wallpaper, which has a more naturalistic stance. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick up with Charlotte Perkins Gilman and The Yellow Wallpaper. So stay tuned.